Mr. Derek Shelmerdine's here. We always have a great time when Derek's here. We have plenty to say, and I don't think tonight's going to be any different. Do you, Derek?
No, it should be a lot of fun. I mean, we are talking about humour tonight.
We are, definitely.
So people will be cropping up tonight, and tracks tonight you're very unlikely to hear on this kind of show ever again.
You are indeed.
All good.
If you'd like to get in touch and talk to Derek about humorous records, I mean, perhaps because of the time constraint, we can only get 3 tracks in, plus everything, obviously, that Derek's got to say. Perhaps we've missed out. Perhaps one of your favourite comedy records of all time. You never know. If you want to get in touch and put your little sort of tuppence halfpenny worth in, please do. The email is studio@meridianfm.com, or the Twitter is music4 word music number 4 _ grownups, or the Facebook page is very simple, Music for Grownups with me, Dave Roberts. Derek, first up, welcome.
Thanks, Dave. Really looking forward to tonight. Should be so much fun.
When you do these, any of the projects, not just tonight's one, but when you do any of the projects, but particularly in something like tonight, when we're doing a comedy section, what exactly goes into the actual makeup of this 40-odd minutes that you put together?
Well, there's a lot of research. Obviously, there's a base level of knowledge there. But what's interesting is, we choose a subject, and then I delve into it to have a look at more of the background. And invariably, it's like when I was writing the book, Rock'n'Roll Unravelled. I just kept discovering more and more great people, more and more great songs, more and more interesting things that I'd never known before. You suddenly discover that people you'd liked for a very long time, had been indulging in all sorts of things you'd never got a clue about. And it's just fascinating. It's a lot of effort, but it's well worth it in the end.
Yeah.
And I keep discovering great new tracks as well, as you think. I mean, the one that we kick off the second part of the show at 10 o'clock is... it's just such a great opportunity to play it, a Lou Reed track. I mean, I won't explain the relevance of it just now, but I mean, it's not the happiest of tracks. But I thought, following 3/4 of an hour of fun, jollity and humour, when we're talking about just about everybody from Charlie Drake's Bonzo Dog Band, Lenny,
good old Lenny
Bruce.
Yeah.
And because they've all got rock and roll. What we're looking at here essentially are people with rock and roll connections.
Do you think that the comedy record, I mean, obviously comedy records can come out any time, but do you think, did it have a golden age, if you like, the comedy record?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because one thing we will be getting into sort of halfway through the show is the whole era of the Billy Connolly type era. And what's really fascinating about that, when you sort of delve into the minutiae, is that we've sort of 4 key players there. I don't want to preempt too much of that bit, but basically they were all born within about 3 years of each other. And if you look at when they had their sort of first and usually only singles, they were all within almost months, certainly within a year of each other. So it tends to vary. And if you look at one of the other things we'll be looking at shortly, is people like Richard Digance, Tom Lehrer and Jake Thackeray.
Oh.
I mean, the sort of thinking man's comedy, if you like.
Jake Thackeray, to me. Oh, it takes me back. He was always on... was it That's Life? With Esther Ranson.
Yeah.
He was always like the singer. And the things he came up with were... I mean, I was... I don't know, 12 years old at the time, but even I would just sit there in hysterics, just listening to what the guy was going on about. It's such a clever man.
Yeah. But what's interesting about them, you've got one that was sort of dominant in the 50s, one in the 60s, and one in the 70s. So it was almost like a relay race. Because I wouldn't suggest that their music is anybody's copying anybody else, but it's all in the same kind of satirical almost vein. Not necessarily satirical in the Peter Cook way, but it's down that kind of route, and it's got elements of Flanders and Swan. I mean, the first person that would be interesting to look at is George Martin. The Beatles producer. The first thing you think about when you hear the name George Martin is obviously the Beatles. But what's really interesting about him was that before he got involved in pop music, He was very much down the comedy route, the specialist novelty records, jazz, classical music, anything but. He did have a dabble with Tommy Steele. I mean, it was just at the beginning there, really. I mean, 1950s when it all started for him. He joined Parlophone, sort of branch of EMI, and he was assistant to Oscar Press, who actually ran the Parlophone label. Now, Parlophone was very much not a pop label at all in those days. I mean, it was very much people, and these are all people that George Martin was involved in arranging, stroke producing. He would and these are major names from that era: Johnny Dankworth, Humphrey Littleton, Cleo Lane, Stan Getz on the sort of jazz side. But he had a lot of humour. I mean, Peter Ustinov, 1952. Which I think it was the earliest, might be the first George Martin comedy production. That was he released a 45 called Mock Mozart, and you can imagine Peter Ustinov. I mean, that is going to be serious. I haven't managed to hear it. That sounds
wonderful
seriously
voice.
fun. Oh, amazing voice!
Yeah.
And been so amazing. He was in Spartacus, wasn't he?
Was he really?
Yeah, he was in Spartacus. He wasn't actually one of the ones standing up saying "I am Spartacus." He was the one in the movie who would more like sort of run and hide behind a milk jug.
Because of my, the era that I come from, the thing I remember him most was he was in a Disney film called Blackbeard's Ghost.
Oh,
and
right.
he played the ghost, Blackbeard, who was a pirate.
Yeah,
but his voice was just, he was like...
Yeah. Brian Blessed.
I was going to say he could have been Brian Blessed's dad,
exactly.
couldn't he? It just this magnificent timbre to his voice and such power. There's wonderful sound.
Yeah, and I mean, people like Peter Sellers, Spike Milligan, Dudley Moore, I say Flanders and Swan, they all produced by George Martin. But he also produced people like Judy Garland, Matt Monroe. So, his range and skills are amazing. And Shirley Bassey. And he took over from Oscar Press in 1955, and he became head of Parlophone. It was around then. A little later, that he actually went to the Two Eyes because the whole skiffle thing was coming on, and he's the man who turned down Tommy Steele. He signed it. Well, he wasn't. They weren't technically his backing group, but Tommy Steele often appeared with a group called the Vipers, Wally Whiten, and at the time, George Martin decided that he'd rather sign up the Vipers than Tommy Steele. I think he did produce Tommy Steele later, but Tommy Steele went off to Decca. So if you like, you've got the whole Beatles story reversed there, where Decca turned them down, and George Martin decided they were worth a punt. But I mean, people like Sellers, at the end of '59, he released an album called Songs for Swingin' Sellers, which was actually sketches and obviously a play on words around the Sinatra album, Songs for Swingin' Lovers.
Yeah.
But you get to the early '60s, and you look at a golden age. And to a great extent, the 50s and the 60s laid the groundwork for everything in that sort of vein that followed. I mean, the very early 60s, you've got the Beyond the Fringe, and he on the album of the recording of the last night of that, he's credited on the sleeve as supervising the recording. Because, I mean, a live recording, you don't really produce it as such. You just engineer it. You just try and get a halfway decent sound onto the tape and hope for the best. And then Alan Bennett, Jonathan Miller, and the legendary Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. I mean, interesting, disparate sort of three of them, very much sort of your Cambridge Footlights types, and Dudley Moore. So it's, I mean, he brought a lot to them. If you watch those Beyond the Frill, or listen to the albums, or watch them, because there's a lot of movies, videos of them performing, and he really does fit in with the whole humour there. But the whole Python thing, without Beyond the Fringe, there would have been no Python. And people like Spike Milligan, I forget the something for T4. He had a TV show. I think it was pulled actually because he got too risky for the for the good old BBC anti-Beeb at the moment. And I mean, he did some awesome stuff in the early '60s.
We did the Q series, didn't we?
That was it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just marvellous stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know what number it started at. I don't think it started at 1.
Probably not.
Probably not, but I can remember very much, was it Q8 or Q9 and stuff, and just the most amazing humour, which some people would look at and be blank and stony-faced and thinking, why are you laughing? This is not funny. Yeah. And the person next to them is on the floor holding their ribs. They're laughing so much. You know, it really was it's Marmite humour.
Yeah, exactly.
It really is, you know, love it and hate it. You know?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was one interesting era. But, I mean, if you look at one of them, he was Charlie Drake. But anybody who's never heard Charlie Drake, do yourself a favour, check out YouTube, check out iTunes, check whatever out and look for Charlie Drake. There was nobody quite like him.
Hello, my
very
darlings.
Interesting. Absolutely.
He used to say, didn't he?
Hello, my darlings. Exactly. Yeah. And he had half a dozen hits in the UK. And George Martin produced some of those. And he actually produced the My Boomerang Won't Come Back. Now, what's interesting about, a few interesting things about that. One is it was the only hit that Charlie Drake had in America. So how Charlie Drake fitted into the American humour, I cannot really figure that one out.
Do you think is the comedy record, is it a British thing, or is it, or do we have, you know, are there? I know there are a few American comedy records. I know, but did they sell well, or do you think it's mainly, is it us?
I think it's probably. I would think they're probably more associated with the UK. I mean, Tom Lehrer, he mentioned earlier, he was in the 50s. So, I mean, he was there early days, and Lenny Bruce we'll talk about shortly. I mean, he was very much there in the 60s. But I think it's maybe the English humour lends itself very much because, you know, it's very much radio humour to a great extent. I mean, radio humour can transfer to disc very, very easily. And whereas in the UK, we had, you know, the home service in those days. The light service in those days, where all these sort of shows would be on. I'm not sure how many comedy stations there would be in America. The big difference in America in the 50s was that they didn't have a BBC-type monopoly. They had rock stations, rock and roll stations. They had country stations, blues stations for every genre that you could think of. So I doubt there would be a comedy station, so there probably wouldn't have been the sort of outlet. And I mean, you know, you think about the American humour was more in the movies, I think. You know, the road movies, Bob Hope, given that he was English, Bing Crosby, the TV humour with people like Lucille Ball and Sergeant Bilko would have been very big. Now they're TV, so not as easy to transfer to records. So I think you're probably right. You know, if you delved into it, I think you'd probably find there was an awful lot more of a tradition of comedy albums.
I do remember
this side of the pond.
One of the ones they used to play on something like Junior Choice many, many moons ago was the one, and for the life of me I can't remember. It's the one about where he goes off to summer camp.
Oh, yeah, that's...
no, I can't remember what it's
Camp
called.
Granada.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Hello, Mother. Hello, Father.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember who it was. I mean, anyone out there...
The name will come at some point.
Help us out, please help us out. No, we'll get there. Don't worry about it. We'll think about it later on.
But, I mean, there's an awful lot to cover, so it's probably well worth hitting that first track. But just before we listen to it, Charlie Drake, My Boomerang Won't Come Back. Now, this was released in... Well, the date is really quite important. October the 5th, 1961. Now, I can see people out there in Radioland scratching their heads and thinking, October the 5th, that rings a bell. Well, on October the 5th, that was the date it entered the charts in 1961. On October the 5th, 1962, George Martin had just finished the final touches to the Beatles' Love Me Do. On October the 5th, 62, Love Me Do was released. And if you listen to the sound effects on this, you can see he couldn't wait for 1967 and the Sgt. Pepper album to get lots of these special effects back into gear.
This is Charlie Drake and My Boomerang Won't Come Back. Charlie Drake. Charlie Drake there and My Boomerang Won't Come Back. I mean, I mean, I sat there and definitely couldn't have laughed at all. I found it quite easy not to laugh because to me it just wasn't funny at all. I found it a bit irritating, to be honest.
Mm.
But you know, I guess in 1961 people would have laughed at that, wouldn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think it's funny. Well, I thought it was funny in 1961 because he made another one around the same sort of time called Mr. Custer, about Custer's Last Stand. But that was actually produced by George Martin. Yeah, that was actually produced by George Martin, which is why we chose that particular one. It was a hit in America too. Made number 21 in America, number 14 in the UK.
Yeah.
Absolutely
amazing,
incredible.
Yeah. Did it sell in Australia, do you know?
I think it was number 1 in Australia. I haven't checked that, but I read somewhere that he did make number 1 in Australia with that, which is not surprising.
Yeah, yeah.
So, because it's a very mainstream record.
Charlie Drake, eh?
Yeah. But, you know, you were talking earlier about sort of timings, and I mentioned that, you know, the whole folk circuit threw up a genre of comedies, and very much Billy Connolly, Max Boyce, Mike Hardin, and Jasper Carrott were at the forefront of that humour that came from the folk clubs in the 70s. And they were all born between 1942 and 1945. And what's really quite interesting is how highly rated they are by the establishment, as it were, or the public, or however we look at it. With the exception of Mike Harding, all the other three have been honoured. Billy Connolly got a CBE, Max Boyce got an MBE, and Jasper Carrott got an OBE. Now, I'm not quite sure why they all didn't quite get the same one.
I don't know which one's the most significant of the three. I've no idea.
I'm not sure, to be honest. I think it might be. I don't know.
No, nor do I.
But
they haven't given me one.
No, I'm still waiting. But I have some degree of optimism about that. Possibly not. But Billy Connolly, he really did come from a sort of musical background. He was in a band called the Skillet Lickers in the mid-60s, 65-ish. And then joined the Humble Bums, where he played banjo. Now, by the time they got to their second LP, they were really quite active, the Humble Bums. They were around for a second half of the 60s, basically. Jerry Rafferty joined them towards the end of the 60s, and they actually split up. The Humble Bums didn't split up till 1971. Billy Connolly decided to go into stand-up, and Jerry Rafferty, he went off and formed Steelers Wheel. And other great things. Worked with some good sax players over the years. And Billy Connolly's first album came out in 72, and you can see the actual commercial success. They were all going for some years, and then they all found commercial success about the same sort of time. Mike Harding was at a gig in Leeds with a band called the Edison Bell Spasm Band, and he started telling jokes, and he found that he'd essentially covered half the set without playing a note, so decided to go off to the world of stand-up. And Mike Harding came from the same kind of area. And Max Boyce recorded a lot of his stuff. A lot of his stuff is it's all very Welsh, and a lot of it's very rugby focused, recorded in the rugby clubs. And of course, Jasper Carrott, he became host of the Boggery Folk Club in Birmingham in the mid-70s. But their success all comes around the same time. In May 74, Max Boyce released Live in Treorchy, and then in August 75, Mike Harding got to number 2, his only UK hit with Rochdale Cowboy. Jasper Carrott, his only UK hit on the 16th of August, so 2 weeks later. So to say there was a timing thing going on there, that's absolutely unbelievable. That was Funky Moped and Magic Roundabout. He got to number 5 with that. Billy Connolly had a lot more success, but his first hit single was in November 75, so within the space of 4 to 5 months, 6 months at best, all three of them had a hit single. Billy Connolly's first was Divorce, which was a sort of spoof on the Tammy Wynette Divorce. But he went on very much then to have I wouldn't quite say a string, but he had a few more hit singles. And Max Boyce, in 75, November the 1st, released an album called We All Had Doctor's Papers. And that got to number 1 in the UK, and the Guinness Book of Records put it as the only comedy song to reach number 1. And if you look at those are all within the space of 5 months.
Yeah,
absolutely awesome. Just coincidentally, that's just the time the punk was getting it. No, it's not. It's 10 years after punk. That was another reference I was thinking of earlier. So for some reason, in late 75, comedy records from folk-based artists were very much all the go. So it's interesting genre there.
Yeah, amazing.
But another guy that I really do like is Lenny Bruce, and he's got a really interesting career. But we're only just going to touch on his crossover with the rock and roll world here, and that's very much with Frank Zappa. I mean, he recorded a concert at Berkeley in 1965, and Zappa released that a few years later on his Bizarre label. And interesting enough, the last concert that Lenny Bruce ever played, which was June 24, 25, 1966, at the Fillmore Auditorium, he was supported by Frank Zappa's group, and they were called The Mothers at that particular point. The record label decided that The Mothers was a tad risque, so they inserted the Of Invention into the band's name. But Lenny Bruce died 6 weeks after that gig, on the 3rd of August, and Zappa's first album, Freak Out, appeared 2 days after that gig.
Because Lenny Bruce, obviously, he was more of he was a very adult comedian, wasn't he?
Very much so, yeah. I struggled to find something to play. I did find something.
Well, I've not heard what you've chosen, so I do hope that it's suitable.
And it is. I mean, there was another one that's really funny, but the trouble is, some of the words, the individual words, the 5 or 6, 7 letters that form the word, today, there are some ears so sensitive that they virtually collapse and fall over if they just hear the word in any kind of context whatsoever.
Yeah.
So I thought those particular words wouldn't be a good idea to play on the radio. But he's interesting. He was hounded by the police. He actually got he was thrown in prison a few times, and he actually got an apology. And well, it was more than an apology. I think it was New York Police Department. 20 years, 15 years after he died, they actually gave him a pardon because they locked him away for, I can't remember now, 6 months or something for saying naughty words at a show.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, those same naughty words, well, most of them, the sort of sexual naughty words, you just hear on the TV now. In the afternoon, nobody blinks an eyelid.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So
I do remember seeing the film with Justin Hoffman.
Justin Hoffman, yeah.
Who did a superb job.
Oh, he did.
It's a great film.
Yeah. He was an interesting guy. I mean, he died of a drug overdose. And he was a heroin addict.
I've actually got the Lenny soundtrack album on vinyl.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now he's kind of spurred me on. I might dig it out and actually have a listen.
Absolutely. Oh, he's an interesting guy. And if you listen to him with today's ears, as it were, and how far the whole language thing has come, and look at the way he was hounded by the FBI and the authorities, banned from everywhere, banned from entering the UK. The UK wouldn't let him in because he said naughty words in shows. Absolutely incredible. But I thought this one is great. I mean, it's only 1 minute 49 seconds of Lenny Bruce from one of his earlier albums. Well, not so much earlier album, it was 1961, and it's a track called a skit called Airplane Glue.
Lenny Bruce.
Yeah, I love that. 2,000 tubes of airplane glue.
Oh dear, hang on. Why has it done that? Naughty thing. What's the matter with these CD players? I don't know.
Wow, they're haunted. He couldn't wait to get on, that's what
Guess
it was.
what third record we're playing?
That was a clue. Please phone in and win your $10,000. Yeah. Well, you couldn't really say he had a tragic life, but he's an interesting character to learn more about. And just a couple of other people sort of in passing. I think you couldn't talk about this sort of thing without a mention of Freddy Starr, who was a very popular comedian in the 70s. Now, to say he came from a very strong musical background is one of life's real understatements. I mean, he was actually born, his mother thought he was called Freddie Fowle, and that's what he's credited on a song called Twist at the Top he recorded with Howie Casey and the Seniors. Very, very well-respected Liverpool band, and that's back in the late 50s, early 60s. That record came out in 62. But again, in 1962, he was with a band called the Midnighters, whose drummer was Keith Hartley. So there's a drummer who went on to interesting things. And even more so, in 1964, Freddy Starr was with a band called the Flamingos, and the drummer with them was none other than Ainsley Dunbar. So, you know, he played with if he'd been a bass player, he would have been in some of the strongest rhythm sections of all time.
He would, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
Not bad.
That's Freddie Starr. Like, everybody knows him as from that. And the other quick mention has to be Spinal Tap.
Oh, yes.
I mean, one of the funniest films. Absolutely incredible. Captures the mood of a metal band on the road, I think. And apparently the scene in the movie where they're wandering around backstage and they can't find the stage is based on a true story. A true story that comes from Tom Petty when he was in Germany. And he was apparently wandering around and there were lots of doors. And he ended up in an indoor tennis court. So they decided that was quite a nice story. So they popped that one into Spinal Tap. But the last sort of general area of comedy I thought would be interesting to look at is the whole sort of Monty Python group, because the stuff that came before them and came after them, it's riddled with musical references. And Python itself, if you didn't know, it comes essentially from two shows in sort of 67. At last, the 1948 show that had Cleese Chapman, Tim Brooke Taylor, Marty Feldman in, and Do Not Adjust Your Set that had Eric Idle, Terry Jones, Michael Palin in. Now, David Jones, Neil Innes and Viv Stanshall were also involved in Do Not Adjust Your Set. Innes and Stanshall, of course, went off and formed Bonzo Dog band. The first Python followed at the end of 1969, and it wasn't really until after that all finished. I mean, Cleese went off to Fawlty Towers, which doesn't really have a lot in the way of musical references, but Eric Idle went off to do Rutland Weekend Television,
which was awful.
Yeah,
wasn't good.
No,
well, not up to their standard anyway.
No,
wasn't good. I didn't like it.
No. But, you know, that was very much a spoof on the Beatles. I mean, the band, the Ruttles, came out of that. They made records, they made albums, and very much a spoof. And Neil Innes was very much
as well,
a part of all that. And, of course, the Bonzo Dog Band were running alongside of all this, because they started around, well, in the sort of mid-60s. Managed to get their first album out in about 1967. But they crossed over as well with another gang of guys from Liverpool, the Scaffold, and they got together in the early 60s. The Scaffold were John Gorman, Roger McGough, and Mike McGear. Mike McGear, of course, being Paul McCartney's brother. Didn't really want to capitalise on his siblings' quite popular appeal at the time, so he changed his name to McGear. Yeah, he wrote a lot of stuff. They did Thank You Very Much was one of their chart hits, and Mike McGear is credited as the writer with that. But the Scaffold actually sort of started out a performance at the Liverpool Arts Festival. I think John Gorman put together, and they called themselves the Liverpool One Fat Lady All Electric Show. And I think the reference there is One Fat Lady being the bingo call, Two Fat Ladies 88, and I think they were from, or it was, but the festival was in Liverpool 8. So I thought that was really quite a clever kind of number. And they went on, actually, they combined to form the Grims.
Oh. Derek's just lost.
Falling apart.
Derek's just lost his headphones.
Decided to spin around, have a quick look at how everything's working, and off came the headphones. So we're having a laugh in the studio. That, of course, was a piece of planned slapstick just to keep the mood flying. But of course, the Grims came together in the 70s. That was when the Scaffold and Bonzo Dog got together with John Gorman, Roger McGough, Mike McGeer, Neil Innes, and Viv Stanshall. So there's just so much crossover between all these guys, and thinking of the whole Peter Sellers and others, and Peter Cook particularly. When you move into that was the week that was, because there's a lot of music associated with that as well. Millicent Martin was performing there, and in fact, Tom Lehrer. Talking to Tom Lehrer earlier, he wrote. In the 60s for the American version of That Was the Week That Was. And there was quite a lot of television that incorporated music as well. The Young Ones, that was very much a comedy show, but they had one live music slot in the middle of the show every week. So I think it's great to see how... calling it all, under the general banner of rock and roll, how it's brought into a whole host of different areas.
Yeah.
Looking at, that was all the sort of main areas I wanted to cover. But you just look at it, and it's fascinating how it overlaps everywhere. Rock music and.
What about today, Derek? What's the comedy record scene like today? Anything happening? I know we're getting, you get DVDs of comedians, that sort of thing. But
I think it's more DVDs than.
But is there a likelihood of a comedy single doing anything nowadays? I can't think of any.
I would be surprised if, unless it was a charity single, whether it would find a lot of success. Today it's a much more visual world. So the comedy now and the stand-up comedy. Yeah. And it's all very politically correct now, comedy. Your Lenny Bruces. There aren't many Lenny Bruces. There are some around. There are Chubby Brown, for instance.
There are plenty around who are like Lenny Bruce, but they're just not being heard.
Unless
you actually go and see them. They're not on the... They're just, they're not put out as much.
I think that I'd be surprised to see comedy records popping into the charts.
Yeah. It's just not. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of the lot. I don't know. Would you call Ernie? By Benny Hill. Was that a comedy record, or was that just a good song? No, in a comedic sense.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. Because the guy was a great comedian, and wrote material and performed. Instead of a sketch, it was a song. So absolutely brilliant. That was a great era because Morecambe and Wise, of course. They've got a lot of albums as well.
All sketches though, no real music.
No, there's not much music. Well, there's the Stripper, of course, was one of their famous ones. Yeah, it's choreographed. Was pretty good.
But I think that's about it for comedy records now, don't you? They're not going to make a return, are they?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Well, we got one more to finish up with. Have a quick. Why have you chosen this last one, Derek?
Well, simply because when you look at all this real classic Monty Python comings and goings, Neil Innes just figured in it so much that I thought we should really finish with a Bonzo Dog Doodah Band.
As if you didn't know.
Well, there was a clue earlier.
Derek, as usual, it's been fantastic. You're coming back after the 10 o'clock news?
Yep, back at 10 o'clock.
We're going to be doing what happened on this day over the years gone by.
Absolutely.
But taking us up to the 9 o'clock news now, the aforementioned Mr. Neil Innes and all the rest in the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band. I'm the Urban Spaceman. I'll see you after the 9 o'clock news.